Ku Hungming had helped to cast off my moorings and put me out to a sea of doubts. Perhaps without Ku Hungming, I would have returned to the national stream of thought anyway. No Chinese could, if he was of a searching mind, remain long satisfied with a half-knowledge of the Chinese intellectual landscape. The call to discover one's own history and national heritage was a call from the deep. There was something in the character of the Chinese language which invisibly but most emphatically changed one's mode of thought. The modes of thinking, the concepts, the images, the very sounds of words are so different between the English language and the Chinese. Speaking English, one thinks in English, and speaking in Chinese one thinks inevitably in Chinese. If I were to write 2 essays one morning on the same subject with the same ideas, one in English and the other in Chinese, the essays themselves would come out differently because the flow of thought, following different imagery and allusions and associations, would automatically lead into different avenues. Man does not talk because he thinks, but thinks because he talks, because he has words to play with, and thinking is only the tumbling about of words. The ideas themselves come wearing a different dress and complexion when one speaks a different language, because the words have a different timbre and different associations. Hence, studying Chinese, I began to think as a Chinese, and thinking as a Chinese, I understood and accepted certain truths and imagery almost instinctively. The leap between the two languages, so different as the Chinese and the English, was somewhat bizarre. The English in me laughed at the smooth, shining pebbles of Chinese monosyllabism, and the Chinese in me recognized the greater definition and exactness of English thought, but also ridiculed its jumble of incredible abstractions. Now the Chinese, I must say, have no aptitude for abstract ideas. In the Chinese language, as in woman's gossip, everything creeps or crawls or gets married or has an in-law. Chinese abstract ideas, following the law of Chinese concrete thinking, are often composites of two concrete qualities. Thus big-small stands for size. What is the big-small of the diamond? Long-short stands for length and light-heavy for weight. What is still more inexplicable is that the ordinary word for thing is east-west. Have you got any east-west to eat in the icebox? Strictly philosophic concepts, right, justice, loyalty, interests, are cryptic monosyllables which tend constantly to resemble one another. In the case of Shi and Fei, merging the two pairs of concepts, true and false and right and wrong, the demarcation of areas is almost obliterated. Furthermore, the separation of the heart and the head becomes impossible when Chinese avow that they think with their stomachs. In my belly I think, sometimes in my heart I think. The word Xin means both the heart and the mind at the same time. Wherefore the Chinese are so emotional in their thinking. The biblical bowels comes nearest to it. Oliver Cromwell, in his letter to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in 1650, says, "I beseech you, in the bowels of Christ, consider that ye may be mistaken." In Chinese thinking, therefore, having few abstractions or none, one never leaves the periphery of life. There is no danger of being submerged in the process of abstract ratiocinations too long. One is like a whale which must come up to the surface to breathe the free air, incidentally taking a look at the clouds and the sky. One result of such thinking is the absence of academic jargon in Chinese philosophy, of the specialist's code of communication, and the absence of a division between popular knowledge and scientific knowledge. It was never a shame to write about philosophy in a language which the common people could understand. The Chinese academicians did not look upon the popularizers of knowledge with contempt. It may be true that Plato wrote 2 versions of his philosophy, one technical and the other popular, and that the technical version fortunately did not survive, so that the modern reader may enjoy the clarity of Plato's dialogues. If Western philosophers could use the English language with the ease and clarity of Plato, philosophy might yet win a place in the common man's thinking, which it decidedly has not. I suspect that if they were to write clearly, they would reveal that they haven't anything to say. I have sometimes asked myself, did China ever produce a mind like Kant's? The answer is obviously no. Moreover, she could not. A Chinese Kant would laugh at himself the moment he talked of the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, his reasoning, and he could have a powerful reasoning, immediate and intuitive. His reasoning would tell him that he was becoming ridiculous. All knowledge, according to Kant, is derived from sense perceptions. Fine. All reasoning is determined by a priori laws of the mind. Fine. Thus a blind man would gain knowledge of a pear or a banana by feeling the difference between the texture of the pear skin and of the banana skin through the tactile sense of his fingers. Surely, however, the Chinese philosopher would feel that there must be qualities and differences in the pear skin and the banana skin corresponding to the resulting differences in touch. Isn't this knowledge real? What do you want to know the banana in itself and the pear in itself for? Granted that a different being, differently constituted and endowed with different psychic powers, say a Martian, would by a different kind of sense feel the difference between the banana skin and the pear skin in a different way. Would not this difference still correspond to a difference between the banana in itself and the pear in itself? What profit is it, then, to talk of the banana in itself and pear in itself, instead of apprehending the immediate feeling and experience of the tougher skin of the pear and the smoother, softer skin of the banana, which communicates itself to one immediately, accurately, and most usefully? And so with the immediate apprehension of the differences in sound waves by the ear and of light waves by the eye. These are nature's ways of knowledge, so subtly developed that a deer can apprehend the presence of a tiger at a great distance by its smell or sound or sight. These senses must be extraordinarily accurate and must correspond to the real environment and therefore must be real, or the deer would not be able to survive. It should be remembered, for instance, that the picture of a changing outside world, such as that of a car 200 yards away and moving in one's direction or away from it, is recorded in the image of the retina within the area of half an inch, and therefore the image of the moving car itself can only be perhaps 1/1000th of an inch, and this slight change in the 10,000ths of an inch is registered immediately and usually infallibly. What did Kant want to talk about the car in itself for? The Western philosopher will answer immediately, "You Chinamen, you don't understand what Kant is talking about." "Of course I don't," counters the Chinese. "Now may I eat my banana?" And so the Occidental and the Oriental must shrug their shoulders and part company. And I have also asked myself, did China ever produce a mind like Aristotle's? The answer is, again, obviously no. Moreover, she could not. The capacity for analysis, the systematic and logical examination of ideas, the objective interest in the different avenues of thought and fields of knowledge were not there. For the striking thing about Plato and Aristotle is that their mode of reasoning is so modern, and the Chinese mode of reasoning is totally different. After all, the medieval scholastic type of reasoning and the epistemological witch hunt began with Aristotle. A Chinese is well prepared to hear about Aristotle's ethics and politics and poetics, and is amazed and duly impressed at his breadth, at his knowledge of botany and astronomy and meteorology and biology, crude as his notions often are. The dispassionate inquiry, the curious objective dissection of life in all its segments in physics and biology, for Aristotle was a medical doctor, is astounding. The limited vision of the Chinese compels him to make a scientific classification of all chicken as either tough or tender, while its possible relation to other fowls such as the pheasant or the guinea hen is dismissed at once as idle. Confucius had a disciple, Cixia, who had a propensity for accumulating facts of information, and who was interested in the birds and insects mentioned in the Book of Songs. Confucius said to him, "Be a gentleman's scholar, do not be a petty scholar. That type of knowledge which consists in memorizing facts to answer questions is not worthy to make one a teacher." The Chinese, in fact, are given to the intuitive comprehension of the totality, which Professor F. S. C. Northrop of Yale calls the undifferentiated aesthetic continuum. What Professor Northrop means is that the Chinese like to size up things at a glance and thus preserve a better sense of their totality. They are forever suspicious of the dissection of the indivisible. They rely rather on the immediate perceptions. What Egon Friedel says of Emerson's style of thought is true of the Chinese philosopher. His propositions are there, unprepared, indisputable, like sailors' signals coming out of a misty deep. He is an absolute impressionist in his style, his composition and his thought. He never propounds his ideas in a definite logical or artistic form, but always in the natural and often accidental order which they have in his head. Things like order of content, introduction, transitions do not exist for him. He begins to develop this or that view, and we think he is going to weave it systematically, elucidate it from all sides, and entrench it against all possible attack. But then, suddenly, some alien picture or simile, epigram or apophthegm strikes him, full in the middle of his chain of thought, and the theme thenceforward revolves on a quite new axis. So my grand detour began. At first it made no sense to me. Trained in the modern weapon of thought like any college graduate, my mind had to flash across the continents of thought, and found them strange, or uninteresting, or jejun. Confucius always sounds a little jejun at first. I wrote on my 40th birthday a couplet to myself. One mind seeks the learning of ancients and moderns. Two legs straddle the cultures of East and West. I had to interpret the Chinese conscience and intuitive perceptions in the more exact frame of logical thinking, and subject the propositions of Western thinking to the test of Chinese intuitive judgment. I must therefore pause to describe in separate chapters what I have seen on the way before I came to accept Christianity as a satisfactory answer to man's spiritual problems. Some people have expressed surprise and even regret that I have returned to Christianity, and found it hard to believe that I should exchange the gay, cheerful, reasonable acceptance of the world, with its joyful realism, for more questionable and metaphysical entity called the Christian faith. I think I should make the evolution and the transition clear by detailing both the beauties and the deficiencies of the Chinese systems, by pointing out wherein they have reached heights of their own, and wherein they have fallen short of giving a completely satisfactory answer. I should also make it clear that heaven and hell have nothing to do with it. I still know, as I have said elsewhere, that if God loves me only half as much as my mother did, he will not send me to hell, as Christian religion would have it, not for 5 minutes, not for 5 days, but for all eternity, a sentence which even a secular court would never find it in its heart to condemn me to. I would not believe such a thing. I have returned to the Christian church rather by an intuitive perception of my moral being, by one of those signals out of the deep at which the Chinese excel. And I must make it clear that the process is not facile or easy, that I do not lightly change what I have always believed, that I have roamed in the pastures of sweet, silent thought and beheld some beautiful valleys. I have dwelt in the mansion of Confucian humanism and climbed the peaks of Mount Tao and beheld its glories, and have had glimpses of the dissolving mist of Buddhism hanging over a terrifying void, and only after doing so have I ascended the Jungfrau of Christian belief and reached the world of sunlight above the clouds. I shall discuss only Confucianism and Taoism, the two most important and most influential streams of Chinese thought, and Buddhism, the third great spiritual force in the Orient. There were in ancient Chinese philosophy, besides Confucianism and Taoism, also the Sophists, the logicians, the legalists, the Motians or Marxians, followers of Modi or Marzi, and the Yang Chu school living for oneself, besides a number of other minor schools. I shall not even touch upon the Marxians, because the school completely died out in the 3rd and 2nd centuries B.C., and therefore left no permanent influence on Chinese thought. But Modi and his followers were remarkable for the development of the question and answer method and of logic. His was indeed a remarkable religion of asceticism and living for others and self-sacrifice based on the doctrine of fatherhood of God and brotherhood of man, universal love. It is said that the Marxians wore the hair off their calves, that is, worked themselves to the bone to help others. Modi also definitely taught a monotheistic God which he called heaven, the regular word in Chinese for God. For some readings in Modi or Marzi, see my selections in the Wisdom of China and India, and in regard to the logicians or Neo-Marxians, see Hu Shi's The Development of the Logical Method in Ancient China. There was an incredible complexity and richness of thought of divergent schools in the few centuries following Confucius, and also a great deal of interaction between the different schools. For a glimpse of the complex situation, see the extremely important Progomna, or the main currents of ancient Chinese thought by Chuanzi in Wisdom of Laozi, Modern Library, translated by myself, and further, for very stimulating discussion of the interrelation of Confucianism and Taoism, see a Confucian notebook and a Taoist notebook by Edward Herbert in the Wisdom of the East series. In the following 3 chapters on Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, my concern is chiefly with man's spiritual problems and how these respective systems of thought bear on a view of the universe and on a philosophy of life. I am concerned chiefly with the ideals of life and human character. The teachings of Jesus are admittedly in a category by themselves, unique and of a strange beauty, teaching something which is not found in other religions. Yet I should like to say here explicitly, first, that it would not do to make a convenient contrast between darkness and light, or to say that, Christianity being true, Confucianism is therefore false. It would not do to dismiss the Buddhist religion with the simple phrase, heathen idolatry. And it would not do to say that Jesus' teachings on love and humility are right, therefore Laozi's teachings on the power of love are wrong. Perhaps that is the very reason why I must go into these three systems of thought and these ideals of life before comparisons can be made. Second, it must be pointed out that systems of thought are rarely mutually exclusive at all points. Even Stoicism and Epicureanism appear to be mutually exclusive on the surface, but approach each other on closer scrutiny. This is particularly true of the Chinese teachings as regarded by the Chinese themselves. It is not Chinese Pyrrhonism. It is merely the Chinese ability to admit truth and beauty wherever they are found. The great Chinese minds like Po Chui, 8th century, and Su Tungpo, 11th, lived Confucian lives and wrote Buddhist poetry permeated with Taoist sentiments. Especially in the case of Confucianism, it is not possible to say that a Christian cannot be a Confucianist. For Confucianism is the religion of the gentleman, of good breeding and good manners, and to say that would almost amount to saying that a good Christian does not believe in being a gentleman, in good manners. Taoism reinforces the Christian teachings on love and gentleness more than many people dare to admit. And if the Buddhist formula for salvation is different from the Christian one, its basic starting point, the recognition of sin and deep concern with the fact of human suffering, is akin to Christianity. The best example of this merging of cultures is found in the poems of Su Tungpo to his mistress Keoyun. Su Tungpo, one of the greatest of Chinese poets and a great Confucian scholar, was living in exile in his 60s. His wife had died, and his young mistress chose to follow him to his exile in AD 1094 at Huichao. Now, Keoyun had become a Buddhist, and Su praised her as a celestial maiden of Vimalakirti in the service of God Buddhist. In one of the poems, Su Tungpo spoke of her throwing aside the long-sleeved dancing dress of the past and being occupied with Buddhist sutras and the pill furnace, Taoist. When the pill of immortality should be formed, she was going to say goodbye to him and enter the fairy mountains, Taoist. No longer would she be like the fairy maidens of the Wu Gorges, tied to a mortal union, Confucianist. It is this curious mixture of religious emotion and human sentiments which so distinguishes another poem. The imagery of the Buddhist celestial maiden of Vimalakirti, name undefiled, appears again. The celestial maiden, according to Buddhist legend, would scatter flowers from heaven, and the flower petals would slip off the dresses or bodies of the saints, but would cling to those who still had mortal desires. He wrote, when time's due course doth age with white hair crown, and Vimalakirti so well doth one become, fear not the flower petals that do no harm, though the heavenly maiden scatters them around. Thy lips enchant, thy hair glorifies, so this eternal cycle of life goes on, because this sentient heart of love is fond, engenders human gestures and mortal ties. I see thee sit with a sweetly pensive smile, setting thy curls, or archly letting them fall. Tomorrow is Tuanwu Day. Come, I shall pick thee an orchid corsage, and with my wild compose for thee the sweetest poem ever known and write it on the girdles of thy gown. The following summer Keoyun died. She said a Buddhist verse before she drew her last breath, and was buried, according to her wish, near a Buddhist temple. The poem Su Tungpo wrote on the white plum blossoms upon her grave is one of the most exquisite things I have ever read. Bones of jade, flesh of snow. May thy ethereal spirit stand unafraid, though the dark mist and the swamp winds blow. May the sea spirits attend thee, the parrakeets and cockatoos befriend thee. Thy white face doth powder spurn, vermilion must yet from thy lips learn. Flesh of snow, bones of jade, dream thy dreams, peerless one, not for this world thou art made. Such indeed is human life, with its problems of pain and death and loneliness and the relation of the spirit and the flesh, as expressed by a great human spirit. Here the spirit of man is confronted with the problems of human life, with all its pathos and its beauty. It is this very problem of human life which Jesus solved with such clarity and simplicity. 1. Confucius the man. If I write about the mansion of Confucian philosophy now, I am aware that thousands of Chinese scholars have done so before me. Still, I can write only of my own perceptions and insights and my own evaluations and interpretations. I accept nothing, take nothing for granted, and am inclined to strip Confucius and Confucianism of certain notions and beliefs with which they have been colored. I am more of a Taoist by instinct than a Confucianist by belief. The Neo-Confucianists have looked at Confucius' teachings through Buddhist eyes. Why should I not look at Confucius' teachings through Taoist eyes? Confucianism and Taoism are regarded as the opposite poles of Chinese thought. Confucius was a positivist, Lao Tzu a mystic. Confucius' main concern was with man, while Laozi's main concern was with the mystery and nature of the universe. Confucius regarded the universe as a part of man, while Laozi considered man as a part of the universe. And yet the matter is not so clear-cut and simple at close range. I think a great deal of Confucius' concern about God and God's will and his view of the spiritual nature of the universe have been obscured by the usual notion of Confucian positivism. For Taoism means depth, and Confucianism is all on the surface, at least deceptively so. Taoist mind can better appreciate certain aspects of Confucius and his doctrines and save him from the virtue of mere obviousness and occupation with the practical problems of living. In particular, I wish to examine Confucius' attitude and feelings toward the larger problems of death and God's will and the spiritual nature of man. Confucius was born in 551 B.C. out of wedlock. His father was one of the 3 famous captains of Lu, and the following story is told of one of his exploits. Once he had led the Lu army to invade a town. When half of his troops had entered the gate of the enemy town and half was still outside, the enemy suddenly let down the gate from above, and his troops were trapped. Confucius' father, sensing treachery, held up the gate single-handedly until all his troops could beat a retreat. The father of Confucius was well over 60 when he married the youngest of 3 sisters, a very young girl who became Confucius' mother. Confucian Puritans have tried their best to explain away the historical record that he was born out of wedlock, but I think there is no necessity to do so. Children born out of wedlock have often been very brilliant, and this is natural. All children are natural, as a French lady says, but I think illegitimate children are more natural than the others. That is to say, the child is usually the result of a violent romance obeying the law of natural sexual attraction. Other records seem to support the story, for the great historian Shema Qin recorded that Confucius' father died when Confucius was a baby and that his mother would not tell the whereabouts of his father's grave. His mother concealed the truth from him. It was only after Confucius' mother died and when he was grown up that he was able to learn from an old village woman who his father was and where his grave was, thereby enabling him to bury both parents together. Confucius himself was described as 9 foot 6 inches tall, an ancient foot being the length of a span, or 8 inches, which makes him about 6 foot 4 in modern measurements. In any case, his nickname was the Tall Man. In his boyhood, Confucius herded cattle and sheep for Lord Kai and was thus strictly a cowboy, and learned to do many menial things. But unschooled and self-taught, he grew up to be the first scholar of his times. At the age of 50, he was appointed Metropolitan Magistrate of Lu, promoted to Secretary of Public Works, and eventually Grand Minister of Justice. There he had a chance to put his social and political doctrines into practice, but was disappointed and disillusioned in the nobles of Lu, who held the real power. Just as Plato was to be disillusioned and disappointed in Dionysius of Syracuse. Eventually, he resigned and left his country to embark on a long period of travels and wanderings in foreign countries, that is, city-states, for 14 years. Like Plato, he tried again to enter political life, but failed, for in his mind he had his republic, and believed he knew how to order it if given a chance. It was during this period of failure that Confucius was at his best. Very often he was in difficulty, scoffed at and rejected of men, and even arrested and waylaid several times, but he was mellow and mild and did not know what to do, which a great Confucian scholar has pointed out as the most charming aspect of his character. For in this period he showed his true strength. None of the rulers were willing to take him seriously or give him power, and Confucius, the dismay of his disciples, was contented and resigned and even happy. It was his habit to sing or recite poetry to a self-accompaniment on a stringed instrument when arrested or under detention. He went on with his historical studies. After the wanderings of many years, he finally returned to his own country, when several of his disciples were already in the government service. He therefore returned at 67 as the grand old man, a teacher of ministers, and died at 72. It was during the last 4 or 5 years that he did his greatest work. He devoted himself to editing the ancient works embodying a lifetime of historical research, and these were handed down to us as the 5 Confucian classics. The Neo-Confucian Puritans have always tried to paint Confucius as a punctilious, venerable sage. What they did was to make him into a perfect saint and less charming human person. As a matter of fact, Confucius was a Dr. Samuel Johnson of his days and was as much feared as he was respected. According to the Analects, He did quite a few things which scandalized the orthodox critics. "A sage certainly could not have done that," exclaimed such critics. "Such passages must obviously be later interpolations. Glory be to Confucius." I need mention only one instance recorded in the Analects. Confucius apparently had as strong a sense of revulsion against glib talkers and hypocrites as Jesus had against the Pharisees. One day a scholar of this type came to call on Confucius. He told his servant to tell the visitor that he was not at home. Then, in order to show his stern disapproval of this man, who was called Rupe, Confucius did a rude thing. He took up his stringed instrument and sang when the caller was still at the door, in order to let him hear it. Repeatedly Confucius said, "The respectable goody-goodies are the thieves of virtue. The people whom I would not mind not coming in to see me when passing my house are the goody-goodies." Once he described the rulers of his days as rice baskets, good only for stuffing rice, and once he actually took a cane to strike the shin of a man he highly disapproved of, and called him a scoundrel. Such is the paragon of Confucian politeness. The man was as solid as a rock. Born with inexhaustible energy, he was capable of enormous stretches of work, and once described himself as one who neglects his meals in a spell of work, forgets all his worries when he is overcome with joy, and is unaware that old age is coming on. Sensitive and even emotional, once he hated himself for shedding tears without reason, when he found himself accidentally at the funeral of a mere acquaintance, and tried to cover it up by sending a funeral present to make it appear as if he had intentionally come to the funeral. Amiable and gentle with his close disciples, he yet wrote a book, The Spring and Autumn Annals, which was a terrible indictment of the rulers of his days, and said, "I will stand or fall with this book." It caused quite a flurry among the ruling circles because of his verdicts on the usurpers. In such a situation, when a man was at odds with his generation, Confucius exhibited a combination of stubborn pride and a humorous awareness of his own ridiculous situation. At one point in their wanderings, Confucius and his disciples were forcibly detained by some small-town politicians and even denied food for several days so that they were actually reduced to starvation. After several days, many of his followers fell ill. But Confucius continued to make recitals with string music. Selu came in and spoke to Confucius, anger on his face. "Does a moral man also find himself in extremities?" "Yes," said Confucius, "a moral man also does, but he takes it calmly. When an uncultured man finds himself in an extremity, he is apt to commit foolish things." Confucius knew that there was grumbling in the hearts of his disciples, and called in Selu and questioned him. "It is said in the Book of Songs, 'Neither buffaloes nor tigers, they wander in the wilds.' Do you think my teachings are wrong? How is it that I find myself in this situation?" Selu replied, "Perhaps we lack the character to win people's confidence. Perhaps we lack the wisdom to make them follow." "Is that so?" said Confucius. "I will tell you, if men of character could always win the people's confidence, why did Poi and Shutshai have to die of starvation in the mountains? And if wise men could always make the people follow them, why did Prince Picken have to be sentenced to death?" Selu came out and Sekung went in. Confucius asked him, "It is said in the Book of Songs, 'Neither buffaloes nor tigers, they wander in the wilds.' Are my teachings wrong? How is it that I find myself in this situation?" And Sekung replied, "The master's teachings perhaps set too high a standard for the people. Why don't you come down a little?" "Ah, said Confucius, "a good farmer plants a field, but cannot guarantee the harvest. A good artisan can do a skillful job, but cannot guarantee to please his customers. You're not thinking of how to improve yourself, but are only interested in being accepted by the people. I am afraid you're not setting the highest standard for yourself." Sekung came out and Yenwei went in. Confucius said, "Ah Wei, it is said in the Book of Songs, 'Neither buffaloes nor tigers, they wander in the wilds.' Are my teachings wrong? How is it that I find myself in this situation?" And Yenwei replied, "The master's teachings have set the highest standards. That is why the world cannot accept them. However, what does it matter if they are not accepted? The very fact that they are not accepted is proof of their greatness. If we have neglected our ideals, the shame is ours. But if we have made clear what those ideals should be and they are not accepted, it is the shame of those in power. What does it matter if they are not accepted?" Confucius was very pleased, and he said with a smile, "Indeed you have spoken my mind, son of Yen. If you were a rich man, I would be glad to be your steward." In his private life, Confucius seems not to have got along with women. He divorced his wife and once made a rather derogatory remark about women. "The vulgar people and women are difficult to live with. If you are familiar with them, they take liberties with you, and if you keep aloof from them, they resent it. On the other hand, Confucius could not have been an easy man to live with, for his wife found that he had many strange idiosyncrasies. He would have his right sleeve made shorter than his left sleeve for convenience at work, and he insisted on having his nightgown made longer than his body by half, which must have taken a lot of cloth. This plus his fastidiousness about food must have made it difficult for his wife. In chapter 20 of the Analects, which describes the details of Confucius' habits, we are told that Confucius refused to eat this and refused to eat that. Serving each meal must have been a nightmare for Mrs. Confucius, I imagine. Rice could not be white enough, and minced meat could not be chopped fine enough. These things she could see to if she had the time, but he insisted on home-brewed wine and homemade roasts. One day, when she had run out of meat at home and had to get it in a hurry, and found that her husband refused to eat roasts from a delicatessen, she had already partially made up her mind to leave this obstreperous scholar, whose greatness was somewhat difficult to perceive. When again she found her husband refused to eat because she had forgotten to place ginger upon the table, it was about time. But when one day she found that this good man of hers refused to eat meat because it was not beautifully and squarely sliced, it was the last straw. She had no choice but to walk out and leave him to find another woman who could slice the meat squarely every time. What a gourmet! A gourmet is not only a man who appreciates good food, but who also insists on its being served right. Incidentally, Confucius, his son, and his grandson all divorced their wives. We know this indirectly, for both Confucius' only son and his grandson were faced with the highly technical problem of how long a period of mourning one should observe for a divorced mother. The grandson's own children had the same problem. Zhengzi, the great philosopher of filial piety and teacher of Confucius' grandson Ces, also divorced his wife because of her disrespect to her mother-in-law over a trivial matter of cooking pears. In any case, for the greater part of his life, Confucius led the life of a bachelor philosopher. Confucius believed in God and God's will. He said of himself that by the age of 50, he knew the will of God, and that the moral man lives out the even tenor of his life, calmly waiting for the appointment of God. God or heaven in those days was strictly a monotheistic God as Confucius understood it, but there was a popular belief in many other spirits. Once someone asked him, "Is it true that it is better to pray to the spirit of the kitchen than to the spirit of the southeast?" And Confucius replied, "Nonsense. When you have offended heaven, God, you have no one to pray to." Once Confucius was seriously ill. Someone suggested to him, "Why don't you go to a temple and pray?" And Confucius replied, "I have prayed for a long time." In regard to ancestor worship, he said, "Respect the spirits when you pray as if they were present." It is also well known that Confucius seemed to have no concern for the life after death. This is true as far as the main tenor of his teachings goes. On the other hand, the Analects repeatedly records his sense of awe and piety in the presence of death. It also records that the things which he took very seriously were the occasions of sacrifices and fasting. In other words, Confucius assumed the existence of a God high above which directed the events of men in some subtle, mysterious manner, for he strongly believed in destiny and fate, as he showed by his interest in the Book of Changes. His lifelong historical research was concerned with the ancient forms of religious worship. We must assume that this subject of religious worship had exerted a fascination for him. As he said, "If one only understood the meaning of these sacrifices to heaven and earth, and the significance of the services in ancestral worship in summer and autumn, it would be as easy to bring peace and order to a nation as to point a finger at the palm." There was also an aesthetic side to his character. The sensitivity of his nature is shown in his great love of music. He sang almost every day, and when he liked a song sung by others, he would ask for an encore and join him. And Confucius said of himself that when he was studying music in a neighboring country as a young man and heard a certain great musical composition, he forgot the taste of meat for 3 months. This may be an exaggeration, but it certainly indicates a passion for music. His very unusual description of the importance of music as the crowning consummation of a man's education shows him to be the kind of philosopher that he was, always concerned with the invisible influences affecting man's mind and society's morals. 2. The Silent Revolution. Confucius is chiefly known as a speaker of proverbs. This is an impression arising from the miscellaneous sayings of Confucius in the Analects. The Analects is like a book of familiar quotations. They are not only taken out of their context and narrative background, They are not even edited and put into any kind of order. Therefore, it has been very difficult for Western students, and sometimes even for Chinese students, to penetrate into the principles of his thought. Yet it is possible to speak of and examine the Confucian system of thought, centering upon two main ideas, the problem of man and the problem of society. For Confucius was essentially an educator, interested in social reform through self-cultivation of the individual, and he was also a social philosopher. Confucius said, "Among the means for the regeneration of mankind, those made with noise and show are the least important." Confucius had the deep wisdom to try to lay the pattern for man's customs and left the lawmaking to others, for he repeatedly showed his distrust of laws and law enforcement. There was a curious merging of ethics and politics in his writings. Political order had to be based on social order, and social order had to come from the cultivation of the individual. From the emperor down to the common man, he said, the cultivation of the self is the foundation of all. In his theory, he believed that all men were born much alike, but that through habit and customs they grew apart. The gentleman grows upwards, while the common man grows downwards. The ethical and social problem was clearly, then, how to encourage and establish good habits for individuals and good customs for society. He said once, with regard to his distrust of law enforcement, that if you regulate people by laws and law enforcement, people will try to keep out of jail, but will have no sense of honor. If, on the other hand, one regulates the people by morals and moral teachings, the people will have a sense of honor and will reach out toward the good. This is the very basis of Confucius' teachings. In other words, Confucius dealing with the problem of human society was to put the individual approach above the social approach. Social peace and order or social chaos can only come from the individual members who compose that society. Incidentally, in this connection, I may mention that Confucius and Karl Marx took exactly opposite points of view. Confucius believed that social reforms without personal reform were superficial. Marx, that social environment determined men's moral behavior, and that utopias were to be brought about by changes in material environment. The course of events in Soviet history in the past 40 years has proved how disastrous the latter's assumptions are. Soviet history has been largely determined, in spite of ideological dress-up, by the same human ambitions and greed for power and jealousies and ruthlessness as elsewhere among the leaders, and the personal and very human struggle for comfort and privilege at the expense of equality among the ruling oligarchy. In other words, human nature is still the same, whether man lives in a socialist or in a capitalist state. Utopias where everybody loves and trusts everybody else do not come that easy. If we examine the Greek philosophies, we can see that Plato was a communist and Aristotle an anti-communist. Aristotle did not believe that mere socialist reforms could change human nature. Durant in his The Story of Philosophy has put together some very appropriate quotations from Aristotle on this point. In regard to the communistic state advocated by Plato, Aristotle says, that which is common to the greatest number has the least attention bestowed upon it. Everyone thinks chiefly of his own, hardly ever of the public interest. That is an exact comment on the failure of the agricultural collectives in the Soviet Union, the human explanation of that failure. Again, Aristotle says, men readily listen to utopias and are easily induced to believe that in some wonderful manner everybody will become everybody's friend, especially when someone is heard denouncing the evils now existing, which are said to arise out of the possession of private property. These evils, however, arise from quite another source, the wickedness of human nature. Confucius, like Aristotle, put his bet on human nature and proposed accepting human nature as it is rather than changing it. A better society can be brought about, not by changing the systems of production, but by reforms in the men themselves. The human problem has not been solved by the Marxist society. Today, the men and women in the Soviet Union are exactly the same as the men outside it, dominated by the same motives, the same parental care for children, for sending them to better schools than their neighbors' children, the same monetary incentives for work, for higher pay, and the same desires for class and privilege. Private property and inheritance have already been restored. Class and privilege and inequality of pay have grown steadily. It is possible that, given time, this anomalous Russian state will steadily progress toward capitalist society, even permitting free labor and liberty of thought and of travel, while still flaunting the flag of socialism. That is to say, Socialism has to make terms with human nature, not human nature with socialism. History has proved that, contrary to the theory of international communism, Russia has grown to be a strictly nationalistic state, based on national glory and expansion, and that the Marxist followers intuitively distrust the love of the masses and contradict it by instituting the worst and most terroristic regime. Once more, men determine events. Events do not determine men. The doctrine of silent revolution, of social reform based on individual reform and on education, of self-cultivation, is then the Confucianists' first and foremost occupation. Confucianism may be described as the religion of the gentleman, the chunzi. The gentleman is a cultivated man in various stages of perfection and may be more appropriately described as a person who constantly tries to improve and cultivate himself. In contrast to this cultivated man, Confucius always used the word xiao-ren, literally meaning the small man. The exact translation for this small man is neither the common man nor the mean person. The xiao-ren is essentially a vulgarian, an uncultivated, uncultured man. The Analects is full of contrasts between the chunzi and the small man, such as the saying that the gentleman understands what is right, the small man understands what will sell. What makes Confucianism comfortable is that Confucius made no impossible demands on human nature. He was not occupied with the problem of sin, but merely with bad manners and bad breeding and the ignorant smugness of the uncultivated man. He was satisfied if a man had some kind of moral awareness and constantly strove to improve himself. In this sense, Confucianists claim, and claim rightly, that such teachings are easy to practice. Once Confucius said sarcastically, "I do not expect to find a saint today. If I can find a gentleman, I shall be satisfied." The most extraordinary thing was that he set a purely human standard and taught that the measure of man is man himself. To one who loves to live according to the principle of true manhood without external inducements, and who hates all that is contrary to the principles of true manhood without external threats of punishments, all mankind seems but like one man only. Therefore the gentleman discusses all questions of conduct on the basis of himself as the standard, and then sets rules for the common people to follow. Therefore, if the gentleman measures men by the standard of absolute righteousness, then it is difficult to be a true man. But if he measures men by the standard of man, then the better people will have some standard to go by. The Book of Songs says, "In hewing an axe handle, the pattern is not far off." Thus, when we take an axe handle in our hand to hew another axe handle and glance from one to the other, some still imagine that the pattern is far off. Wherefore the moral man in dealing with men appeals to the common human nature and changes the manner of their lives and nothing more. What Confucius did hold up as the ideal was the human best, the best in manhood or true manhood. This philosophical idea of Ren or true manhood became for Confucius an ideal somewhat difficult to attain. He allowed that his best disciple, Yenwei, could maintain Ren for a whole month, but not the others. And being asked on many occasions whether this or that distinguished person was a true man, his answer was invariably that the person in question was wonderful or excellent in some respects, but he did not know about his being Ren or a true man. The Chinese word for Ren sometimes means kindness, but in Confucius it came to mean the human best, the ideal complete development of manhood. It is pronounced exactly like the word for man, also Ren. So that a Ren man was a Ren. It suggests a parallel in the English language in the kindred meanings of human and humane. The English word humanity, like the Chinese Ren, contains the double meaning of humaneness and manhood, the humanity of Christ, and Ren developed into the philosophic meaning of true manhood. The following example throws light on what Confucius really meant by Ren. Once when Confucius was traveling in the south, and his disciples saw that there was no chance of his entering any government to put his doctrines into practice, they wanted to know how Confucius felt. One of them went in to ask Confucius' opinion of two ancient sages who had retired from government under bad kings and eventually died of starvation. The disciple asked Confucius what he thought of these two men. To his surprise, Confucius said a very unusual thing. He said why they were true men. Confucius had very seldom allowed the application of this phrase, true men, either to men of the past or to his contemporaries. The disciple asked again, "Do you think that they had regrets?" And Confucius replied in the following manner, why they wanted to seek Ren, that is, true manhood, and they had realized it. Why should they regret it? the disciple returned to report that Confucius was happy. This shows how inadequate it is to translate the word ren by benevolence or kindness in relation to a question as to the two men dying of starvation in the mountains. Confucius did allow that this true manhood was within the reach of everyone. If I want ren, it is right here by me. But to be a real man, in English as well as in Chinese society, is not easy. I suppose Confucius would say that Abraham Lincoln was a ren, a real man. Example of the human best, consistently maintained at a high level. He would probably say of Benjamin Franklin that he was a genius, but would not know of his being a ren. Thomas Jefferson would be a man of great intellect and of principles, but Confucius would not know. He doubted. Perhaps all three deserved it. I am merely trying to suggest how sparingly Confucius used the word. In the restricted use of the word, the Confucian ideal of ren. The human best was the humanist counterpart of the Roman Catholic saint. What this ren, the realization of the true self, the human best, exactly means will be seen in the following discussion by Tses. 3. Tses, the moral law within. Tses was the grandson of Confucius. He was only 13 years old when Confucius died and was taught by the youngest of Confucius' disciples, Zhengzi. He was the author of several chapters in the Liqi, a Confucian classic, and one of them, the Chengyang, was regarded as so important that it formed one of the 4 books for Chinese schoolchildren. Tses, 492-431 BC. The pronunciation of this word is difficult. The nearest approach to the vowel in English is the unaccented and slurred short I. Pronounce it like an unclear tsai. The sound is suggested by the last syllable of tsetsi, fly, in this book. You see the philosophic basis for Confucianism. It speaks of the spiritual nature of the universe and the moral law governing it. By living in conformity with this moral law, man realizes his true self. Thus a harmony is established between the moral universe without and the laws of true manhood within. In discovering his true self, man finds unity with the universe, and conversely, in finding unity with the moral laws of the universe, man realizes his true self or true manhood. In this short book, I find the most complete statement of Confucian philosophy. The reason why man sometimes fails to realize the human best in him is because he has not come to a true understanding of the universe. To arrive at a true understanding by realizing one's true self is called the way of nature. To realize one's true self from understanding of the universe is called the way of culture. Who has realized his true self gains thereby understanding. Who has gained a complete understanding finds thereby his true self. According to Tses, the universe is a moral order, and what man needs is to discover that moral order in himself and thus reach the human best which conforms with and rivals the moral order of the universe. Confucius remarked, "The life of the gentleman is an exemplification of the universal moral order, Chengyang. The life of the uncultivated person is a contradiction of the universal order. Cheng means the central, and Yang means the constant. The phrase Chengyang means the central constant or the inner unchangeable. I therefore follow Ku Hongming's translation of Chengyang as the universal moral order, as well as in the following quotations from Chengyang. Now, what is this moral law of the universe, and what is the moral law of man, and wherein lies that harmony?" The author of Chengyang makes it clear that he has a conception of this moral law of the universe, which comes very near to the scientific view of the laws governing the universe. This law is universal in its operation and is all-pervasive. The moral law Tao is a law from whose operation we cannot for one instant in our existence escape. A law from which we may escape is not the moral law. It comprises the infinite and the infinitesimal. The moral law is to be found everywhere, and yet it is a secret, for there is nothing so great but the mind of the moral man can conceive of something still greater which nothing in the world can hold. There is nothing so small but the mind of the moral man can conceive of something still smaller which nothing in the world can split. This law or these laws are indestructible and self-existent. Thus absolute truth is indestructible. Being indestructible, it is eternal. Being eternal, it is self-existent. Being self-existent, it is infinite. Being infinite, it is vast and deep. Being vast and deep, it is transcendent and intelligent. It is because it is vast and deep that it contains all existence. It is because it is transcendent and intelligent that it embraces all existence. It is because it is infinite and eternal that it fulfills all existence. In vastness and depth, it is like the earth. In transcendent intelligence, it is like heaven. Infinite and eternal, it is the infinite itself. This law is immutable. The principle in the course and operation of nature may be summed up in one word, because it obeys only its own immutable law. The way in which it produces the variety of things is unfathomable. There follows a rhetorical passage about the physical laws governing the universe. Nature is vast, deep, high, intelligent, infinite, and eternal. The heaven appearing before us is only this bright, shining mass, but in its immeasurable extent, the sun, the moon, stars, and constellations are suspended in it, and all things are embraced under it. The earth appearing before us is but a handful of soil, but in all its breadth and depth it sustains mighty mountains without feeling their weight. Rivers and seas dash against it without causing it to leak. The mountain appearing before us is only a mass of rocks, but in all the vastness of its size, grass and vegetation grow upon it, birds and beasts dwell on it, and treasures of precious minerals are found in it. The water appearing before us is but a ladleful of liquid, but in all its unfathomable depths, the largest crustaceans, dragons, fishes, and turtles are produced in them, and all useful products abound in them. In the Book of Songs it is said, "The ordinance of God, how inscrutable it is, and goes on forever." That is to say, this is the essence of God. This is then the conception of the moral laws of the universe, which led to a conception of the spiritual nature of things. In this matter, Confucius was explicit. Confucius remarked, "The power of spiritual forces in the universe, how active it is everywhere. Invisible to the eyes and impalpable to the senses, it is inherent in all things, and nothing can escape its operation. It is the fact that there are these forces which makes men in all countries fast and purify themselves, and with solemnity of dress institute services of sacrifice and religious worship. Like the rush of mighty waters, the presence of unseen powers is felt, sometimes above us, sometimes around us. In the Book of Songs it is said, the presence of the Spirit, it cannot be surmised, how may it be ignored? Such is the evidence of things invisible that it is impossible to doubt the spiritual nature of things." The following quotation from Tses best sums up the philosophic basis of Confucianism regarding the nature of the moral law, the spiritual truth behind material existence. Regarding the fulfillment of nature by man's dual powers of the moral sense and the intellect, truth means the fulfillment of ourself, and the moral law means following the law of our being. Truth is the beginning and end of material existence. Without truth, there is no material existence. It is for this reason that the gentleman values truth above all things. Truth is not only the fulfillment of our own being, it is that by which things outside of us have an existence. The fulfillment of our being is moral sense. The fulfillment of the nature of things outside of us is intellect. These, the moral sense and intellect, are the faculties of our being. They combine the inner or subjective and outer or objective use of the powers of the mind. Therefore, with truth, everything done is right. Ren, or true manhood, in the form of the moral sense, is based on a moral harmony of the man within and the universe without. When this true self is realized, the universe then becomes a cosmos, and all things attain their full growth and development. This is the philosophic basis of Confucianism. I find this satisfactory. Human nature is not regarded as contradictory to the moral law, to be variously fought against, overcome, or suppressed. Man has the capacity for goodness in him. Thus, in contrast with the later Neo-Confucianism of the 12th and 13th centuries, which had a tendency to emphasize restraint and fear of human passions owing to Buddhist introduction of sin, this primitive or classical Confucianism taught the fulfillment of our nature as the moral law. And this might surprise many students who do not understand classical Confucian idealism. Moreover, this human nature is God-given, says Tses. Hence the opening 3 lines of the Chungyang. Pregnant with philosophic import, what is God-given is called human nature. To fulfill that nature is called the moral law Tao. The cultivation of the moral law is called culture. It is true that even in classical Confucianism, one spoke of regulating human desires, but human nature was seen as something to be fulfilled rather than fought against. The word for fulfill here means literally to follow. Thus the fulfillment of the God-given nature and the realization of man's true self were Confucian tenets. In this, both Confucianism and Taoism agreed. One of the great concerns of the Taoist Chuanzi was to let animals and men live out the even tenor of their lives, or literally, to let them fulfill peacefully the dispositions of their original nature. Confucianism tried to bring out the best in man through cultivation of good habits and customs. Taoism was terribly afraid of all interference. Here we may note some similarities between Confucianism and Taoism. One need not jump to the conclusion that Confucianism borrowed from Taoism because of the use of the word Tao. In ancient and modern Chinese, the word Tao was in general usage, meaning the truth, the way, or simply moral teachings. Thus today we speak of the teachings of Confucius as the Tao of Confucius. Confucius himself used the word again and again, and in the common parlance of classical times, one constantly contrasted a world without Tao, or moral chaos, with a world with Tao, in which moral teachings prevail. In this book by Tses, there are certain phrases very characteristic of what are commonly known as Taoist teachings of inaction. Twice such a statement occurs in Chengyang, such being the nature of absolute truth. It manifests itself without being seen, it produces effects without motion, it accomplishes its ends without action. To accomplish ends without action is of course a typically Taoist doctrine. Again there is the statement, therefore the moral man, even when he is not doing anything, is serious, and even when he does not speak, is truthful. A statement like that about not doing anything and about not speaking is of course reminiscent both of Lao Tzu and of his great follower Chuanzi, who constantly spoke of the teachings without words. It must be remembered, however, that an inference of Taoist borrowings is not entirely justifiable. Tses lived too close to Confucius himself to justify the view that such a unified view of the moral law of the universe was necessarily a borrowing from Lao Tzu, the Taoist. I think we have no right to assume that Confucian teachings consisted of a jumble and miscellany of Confucius wisecracks and moral maxims without a central moral philosophy behind it. 4. Mencius, finding the lost heart. The most important development of the Confucian school was in the teachings of Mencius, 372-289 B.C. After the death of Confucius, the teachings were divided into two schools, one of Sun Tzu and one of Mencius, the former believing in the wickedness of human nature and the necessity of restraint, and the latter believing in the sheer expansiveness of the good heart of man. Mencius said, "The great man is one who has not lost the heart of a child." He started out from the assumption that man has the innate capacity for good and loves what is good, that it is through corruption that man deteriorates, and that therefore the essence of self-cultivation, of preserving one's moral character, consists merely in finding the lost heart of the child. This has become the orthodox school. Mencius has been given a place next only to Confucius, and it is common to speak of Confucian doctrines as the teachings of Kungmeng, meaning Confucius, Kung, and Mencius, Meng. Mencius used the phrase, the expansive spirit. And the following quotation probably best illustrates what Mencius meant. There was once a time when the forests of the new mountain were beautiful. But can the mountain any longer be regarded as beautiful, since being situated near a big city, the woodsmen have hewed down the trees, the days and nights gave it rest, and the rains and the dew continued to nourish it, and a new life was continually springing up from the soil. But then the cattle and the sheep began to pasture upon it. That is why the new mountain looks so bold and denuded, and when people see its boldness, they imagine that there was never any timber on the mountain. Is this the true nature of the mountain, and is there not a heart of love and righteousness in man too? But how can that nature remain beautiful when it is hacked down every day, as the woodsman chops down the trees with his axe? To be sure, the nights and days do the healing. And there is the nourishing air of the early dawn, which tends to keep him sound and normal, but this morning air is faint and is soon destroyed by what he does during the day. With this continuous hacking away of the human spirit, the rest and recuperation obtained during the night are not sufficient to maintain its level. And when the night's recuperation does not suffice to maintain its level, then the man degrades himself to a state not far from that of a beast. People see that he acts like a beast and imagine that there was never any true character in him. But is this the true nature of man? Therefore, with proper nourishment and care, everything grows, and without proper nourishment and care, everything decays. Confucius said, "Keep it carefully and you will have it. Let it go and you will lose it. It appears and disappears from time to time, and we do not know what direction." He was talking about the human soul. It was this faith in the innate goodness of human nature which the later Confucian scholars so loved, and which has been incorporated into the body of Confucian humanism. When the Sung Neo-Confucianists came, they saw the tremendous import of Mencius, and consequently included his books in the Confucian four books to be learned by schoolchildren. Mencius spoke of the great man rather than of the chunzi or the gentleman. He developed the theory of man's higher self and his lower self. Kung Tutsi asked Mencius, "We are all human beings. Why is it that some are great men and some are small men?" Mencius replied, "Those who attend to their greater selves become great men, and those who attend to their smaller selves become small men." This air of the early dawn, this expansive spirit, was something like the élan vital of Bergson. Certainly Mencius had a lot of élan. He was concerned with the seeping out and gradual depletion of this expansive spirit of man, which he said could fill up the whole universe. And he asked, why is it that some men who have a deformed finger would feel ashamed of it and go hundreds of miles to have it fixed by a good doctor? Why is it then, when men have lost this original heart of goodness, they do not feel ashamed of themselves? Mencius went on to speak of the nobility of God as distinguished from the nobility of man. I remember that my father loved to preach on this topic, and his eyes shone when he spoke of the nobility of the God of Mencius from the Christian pulpit. Mencius said, "There is the nobility of God, and there is the nobility of man. The people who are kind, righteous, faithful, and love virtue without fail belong to the nobility of God, and the dukes, ministers, and lords belong to the nobility of man." The ancient people cultivated what belonged to God's noblemen, and they obtained without conscious effort the ranks of man-made nobility. People today, on the other hand, cultivate what belongs to this nobility of God in order to secure man-made honors, and after they have secured the man-made honors, they forsake the things that make for the nobility of God. Thus, they are led grievously astray and must soon perish after all. Mencius said, "All people have the common desire to be elevated in honor, but all people have something still more elevated in themselves without knowing it. What people usually consider as rank or honor is not true honor, for he whom Ko Meng, a powerful lord, has honored, Ko Meng can also disgrace." This cheerful and noble optimism enabled Mencius to teach the capacity for greatness in all men. For he said, all men can become like Yao and Shun, the idealized sage emperors of Confucius. He proved this by saying that in plants and animals, those of the same species are essentially alike, and that the sages and ourselves are of the same species and therefore are also essentially alike. He asked, if all mankind had not the same taste for flavor, why should the world unite in acknowledging the famous chef Ye as the best cook? And if men had not the same taste for music, why should the world unite in acclaiming the great music master Quang? And if men had not the same eye for beauty, why should the world agree in calling Tseru the handsomest man? Therefore I say there is a common love for flavors in our mouths, a common sense for sounds in our ears, and a common sense for beauty in our eyes. Why then do we refuse to admit that there is something common in our souls also? What is that thing which we have in common in our souls? It is reason and the sense of right. The sage is the man who has first discovered what is common to men's souls. Therefore, reason and the sense of right please our minds as beef and mutton and pork please our palate. Mencius assumed that reason and the sense of right are inborn in us. Mencius always spoke about this sense of right with a kind of moral enthusiasm. Once he visited a king, and the king asked him, "Old teacher, how can my country profit from your presence?" Mencius immediately replied, "Why do you speak of profit, sire? Isn't there also the sense of mercy and the sense of right?" And Mencius once said, "I love fish and I also love the bear's paw. If I cannot have both, I would sacrifice fish and have the bear's paw. I love life, but I also love righteousness. If I cannot have both, I would sacrifice life to do what is right." This is the kind of lofty idealism which has nourished the Confucianists' pride and high sense of honor. It is, we must say, a rather high standard. The Mandarinate has often been corrupt, as we know that officialdom in all countries has often been corrupt. But the true Confucian scholars always looked askance at the doings of the corrupt officials and held for themselves the strict moral standard set up by Confucius. One example of this is the method of shiqin, or sending of a death memorandum to the emperor. In the times of tyrants, scholars who wanted the emperor to do what was right and who sent him a memorandum crossing his will knew that they were courting death. In the 7th century, in the time of the megalomaniac Empress Wu, for instance, there was a great imperial secretary, a number of high officials, including the prime minister, the Lord Chancellor, and the president of the imperial secretariat, had all already been sentenced to death for opposing the empress. This official by the name of Liu carried on the fight. He sent up a shiqin to the reception office of the palace, where a drum would be beaten to make sure that it could not be ignored. This official knew what was coming. He therefore had his last supper with his family, gave them his final instructions and his will, and dressed himself in the proper official robes with great calm and dignity. He then committed suicide. 5. The family as a social unit. If Confucius had been only a moral philosopher teaching the ideal of a gentleman or a cultivated moral person, he could never have the influence which he has had over Chinese society as a whole. But Confucius was also a social philosopher. By the permanent results he achieved, he was probably the most successful social philosopher in all history. He had a dream of a social order, and that social order was accepted by the Chinese people for almost 2,500 years, affecting their manners, customs, family life, and social habits and religious worship. Confucius stood for the moral China. He was the moral China, giving form to Chinese society and to Chinese social institutions, from government down to the relationship between husband and wife and man and child. There have been many social philosophers from the Greeks down, and many socialist schemes for a better society, like those of Saint Simon and Fourier, to the present day. None has succeeded. A few have within a few years become ridiculous, and one at least has come to stay, but by stubbornly ignoring human psychology, it has become a disastrous return to tyranny and autocracy, that is, the denial of the goal of socialism. On the other hand, Confucius' dream of a social order kept clear of economics, but laid a tight hold on human psychology, particularly on the love of man for woman and of parent for child. Whoever flouts these laws must perish soon, despite bayonets and prison walls. Even today, Confucius is still the most terrible underground leader in Red China, for the sentiments nourishing revolt are Confucian. Whoever says that Confucianism is dead in China is saying that a mother's love for her child can be dead. And when, in the course of time, the flood of underground human sentiments bursts and explodes, it will not come bearing political or economic slogans, but the simple one: we return to every man his wife, and to every mother her child. We give you back your homes. The extremely amusing account of the Brook Farm in Emerson's Historic Notes of Life and Letters in New England. Emerson described it as a perpetual picnic, a French Revolution in small, an age of reason in a patty pan. The ladies took cold on washing day, as it was ordained that the gentlemen shepherds should wring and hang out clothes, which they punctually did. And it would sometimes occur that, when they danced in the evening, clothespins dropped plentifully from their pockets. In a Fourier society, where everybody did what he could and took what he needed, the most serious sociological problem was, who was going to clean up the table and wash the dishes? Emerson is seldom as easy to read, nor does he elsewhere show at the same time such a continuous sparkle as in these notes. No doubt Confucius dreamed a social dream. His recurrent dream was that of Yutang, for in his old age he said, I must be really getting old. Yutang Duke Chu has not appeared in my dream for a long time. Yutang was the elder brother of Emperor Wu, and was responsible for laying down the social and religious institutions of the Chu civilization, its songs and sacrifices, its ranks and ceremonies, its village festivals, and its manners and rules of social intercourse. Yutang, of course, did not do all these things, but in the mind of Confucius, he stood as a symbol of the social order, glamorized by dances and music, robes and carriages, and temples of worship. This period of Yutang was Confucius' golden age, the dream of a social order in which society was stabilized and everybody knew his rights and responsibilities. It was this social order that he wished to see restored, as against the terrible social disintegration of his days. Confucius said, "I do not create, I only tell of the past." Confucianism was always described by its exponents as the teachings on human relations, Zhenlan, and of the basic, Tatuan human relationships in particular. Of these basic relationships there were 5, each with a particular moral quality to be taught: loyalty between rulers and ruled, love and respect between father and child, affection between husband and wife, humility between juniors and elders, and honesty between friends. All these come under the grand, all-inclusive concept of Lai, or good form, the principle of social order in China. This may be summed up by saying that Confucianism taught good breeding in personal conduct and good form in social intercourse. In this broad sense, it may be said that Confucianism was successful. Chinese may be liars, thieves, corrupt officials, but it will be rare to find a Chinese common laborer or farmer who does not place first emphasis upon good personal relations and good manners, or who can be called rude or ill-bred. I maintain that the frictions of society can best be smoothed by the oil of good manners, and that however you dislike to be robbed, it would make one feel better if the robber would say, "I beg your pardon, but I must borrow this carpet from you." In the story, the rich carpet owner referred to the thief as the gentleman on the roof. The Confucianists constantly claim that they have possession of the eternal truth because Confucius had laid hold of certain inescapable psychological truths about human nature. Insofar as the human psychology or human sentiments will not change and cannot change, these truths are eternal. Let all the other schools teach what they like. Sooner or later, one must come back to those common human truths of the family. Hence, the family system became the core of Confucian teachings. Social action follows naturally from a good family breeding. Learn to be a good child at home, a good son, and a good brother, and all the other goods will be added unto you. I think it is always more desirable for the reader to have first-hand acquaintance with the original than to rely on any paraphrase of mine. For this reason, I am giving here extracts from a lengthy conversation between Confucius and the king of his country, Duke Ai, in chapter 27 of the Licky, a Confucian classic, concerning this very broad principle of Lai, the principle of good form in society. Confucianism is usually referred to as the religion or teachings of Lai, Lai Chio. Duke Ai asked Confucius, "What is this great lie? Why is it that you talk about lie as though it was such an important thing?" Confucius replied, "Your humble servant is really not worthy to understand lie. But you do constantly speak about it," said Duke Ai. Confucius, "What I have learned is this, that of all the things that the people live by, lie is the greatest. Without lie, we do not know how to conduct a proper worship of the spirits of the universe, or how to establish the proper status of the kings and ministers, the rulers and the ruled, and the elders and the juniors, or how to establish the moral relationship between the sexes, between parents and children, and between brothers, or how to distinguish the different degrees of relationships in the family. That is why a gentleman holds lie in such high regard, and proceeds to teach its principles to the people and regulate the forms of their social life. When these are established, then he institutes different insignia and ceremonial robes as symbols of authority to perpetuate the institutions. When everything is in order, then he proceeds to fix the periods of burial and mourning, provide the sacrificial vessels and the proper offerings, and beautify the ancestral temples. Every year sacrifices are made in their proper seasons, in order to bring about social order in the clans and tribes. Then he retires to his private dwelling where he lives in simple contentment, dressed simply and housed simply, without carved carriages and without carved vessels, sharing the same food and the same joys with the people. That was how the ancient princes lived in accordance with Lai. Duke Ai, why don't the princes of today do the same? Confucius, the princes of today are greedy in their search after material goods. They indulge themselves in pleasure and neglect their duties and carry themselves with a proud air. They take all they can from the people and invade the territory of good rulers against the will of the people, and they go out to get what they want without regard for what is right. This is the way of the modern rulers, while that was the way of the ancient rulers whom I just spoke of. The rulers of today do not follow Lai. Confucius was sitting in the company of Duke Ai, and the Duke asked, "What, in your opinion, is the highest principle of human civilization?" Confucius looked very grave and replied, "It is the good fortune of the people that your highness has asked this question. I must do my best to answer it. The highest principle of human civilization is government." The Duke, "May I ask what is the art of government?" Confucius, "The art of government simply consists in making things right, or putting things in their right places." Here follows a most unexpected but most characteristically Confucian connection between government and sexual relations. The Duke, "Tell me more in detail about this art of government." Confucius, "The husband and wife should have different duties. The parents and children should be affectionate toward each other. The king and his subjects should have rigid discipline. When these three things are right, then everything else follows." The Duke, "Can you enlighten me a little more on the method to carry out these three things, unworthy as I am?" Confucius, "The ancient rulers regarded loving the people as the chief principle of their government, and Lai as the chief principle by which they ruled the people they loved. In the cultivation of Lai, the sense of respect is the most important. And as the ultimate symbol of this respect, the ceremony of royal marriage is the most important. The ceremony of royal marriage is the ultimate symbol of respect, and as it is the ultimate symbol of respect, The king goes with his crown to welcome the princess from her own home personally because he regards the bride as so close in relationship to him. He goes personally because the relationship is regarded as personal. Therefore, the sovereign cultivates the sense of respect and personal relationship. Without love, there will be no personal relationship, and without respect, there will be no right relationship. So love and respect are the foundations of government. Duke I want to say something. Isn't it making the royal marriage a little too serious by requiring a king to wear his crown and welcome the princess from her own home? Confucius looked very grave and replied, "Why do you say so? A royal marriage means the union of two ruling houses for the purpose of carrying on the royal lineage and producing offspring to preside over the worship of heaven and earth, of the ancestral spirits, and of the gods of land and grain." Duke excuse me for pressing the question, for if I do not persist, I shall not be able to hear your opinions on this point. I want to ask you something, but do not know how to put it. Will you please proceed further? Confucius, you see, if heaven and earth, representing yin and yang, do not come together, there is no life in this world. A royal marriage is for the purpose of perpetuating the ruling house for thousands of generations. How can one take it too seriously? Confucius then said, "In the art of government, lie comes first. It is the means by which we establish the forms of worship, enabling the ruler to appear before the spirits of heaven and earth at sacrifices on the one hand, and on the other, it is the means by which we establish the forms of intercourse at the court and a sense of piety or respect between the ruler and the ruled. It restores the social or political life from a condition of disgraceful confusion. Therefore, lie is the foundation of government." Confucius then went on to say, "The ancient great kings always showed respect to their wives and children in accordance with a proper principle. How can one show disregard toward one's wife since she is the center of the home? And how can one be lacking in regard for one's children since the children perpetuate the family? A gentleman always shows regard for everything. First of all, he shows a pious regard toward himself. How dare he have no pious regard for himself, since the self is a branch of the family line? Not to show regard for oneself is to injure the family, and to injure the family is to injure the root. When the root is injured, the branches die off. These three things, the relationship toward one's wife, toward one's children, and toward oneself, are symbols of the human relationships among the people. Duke what do you mean by glorifying one's ancestors? Confucius, when a man is distinguished, we call him a princely man Chunzi, and the people gladly follow him and honor him, saying that he is a prince's son or son of a gentleman. Thus his own father is called a prince through him, and his name is glorified. Duke may I ask what you mean by living a full life? Confucius, just follow the natural law of things. Duke may I ask why the gentleman lays such stress on the laws of God? Confucius, the gentleman lays such stress upon God's law because it is eternal. For instance, you see the sun and the moon eternally following one another in their courses. That is God's law. Life in this universe never stops and continues forever. That is God's law. Things are created or produced without any effort. That is God's law. Duke I'm stupid. Will you make it clearer and simplify it so that I can remember? A change came over Confucius' countenance. He rose from his seat and said, "A great man simply follows the natural law of things. A good son simply follows the natural law of things. Therefore, a great man feels he is serving God when he serves his parents, and feels he is serving his parents when he serves God. Therefore, a good son lives a full life." Duke I am extremely fortunate to have heard these words from you, and I crave your pardon if I fail to live up to them hereafter. Confucius, the pleasure is mine. See section above on cess. Psychologically, the family is satisfying as a social unit. It is satisfying even in a semi-religious sense. For no man lives alone in this world, and all religions have to cope with the problem of the loneliness of the human soul. That the human soul is individual and lonely is the reason for all religions and for all organizations such as clubs, societies, the church, and the state. When Yang Chu taught self-love or egotism on the one hand, and Modi taught universal love on the other, Mencius challenged them both and said that human love had its natural gradations or points of emphasis, and that love, to be real, must be based on natural ties of respect and affection. The Confucianists therefore avowed that if man must live in a social unit and learn good form in conduct, the best and the most natural unit is the family, for it is a social unit which is biologically natural. Of course, the basis of family life is biological. The family is founded upon the basic relation between man and woman, as Confucius said, in other words, upon sexuality. Sexuality, or the love of man for woman and of woman for man, is a beautiful thing. This is the way I look at it. For when a man is born, he is dependent upon his parents, but as he grows older, in his teens, he develops a sense of individuality and feels that he is complete in himself. Boys of 12 or 13 normally show almost complete indifference to girls, and vice versa. Then, in the period of maturity, man and woman suddenly feel themselves incomplete and lonely. Then follows the courtship, which is but the act of one soul looking for a soul of the opposite sex. Marriage comes, and man finds his fulfillment in woman and woman finds her fulfillment in man. Then a curious thing happens. Both man and woman are persons or individuals with separate wills of their own. And yet, though physically separate, in a happy marriage they grow to complement each other as one complete being. This is what I call sexuality. In a happy marriage, there is a fusing of personalities, the merging of two wills, so that in having each other and by complementing each other the two beings become one and become complete. There is a complementing of each other's defects, as if man were born with an extra head and an extra pair of eyes. Where one fails, the other sees, and this process goes on every day in tastes, in likes and dislikes, in changing the direction of one's thoughts and opening up new frontiers of feeling and of vision, not so much because they think alike as because they think differently. Thus man and woman, in marriage, is like one who has an extra window to his soul, an augmentation of his psychic powers, for sensing dangers as well as for profiting from life's gifts and joys. Man and woman think differently, and that is the whole value of this intersexual thinking. What man desires in woman is the totality of her womanliness, and what woman desires in man is the totality of his manliness. As seen in many old couples, there is a sense of complete merging and complete belonging. And in woman, even in a young woman, I feel that the sense of complete belonging is more closely associated with love than in man, which means that she has a better, because more intuitive, grasp of the total meaning of sexuality. Thus one achieves solace in sorrow and shares happiness in success. Where this complete, or even partial, merging does not take place, there are inevitable disharmonies and conflicts, as when one partner is resistant to such merging, or tends to impose his or her will on the other, or simply has not got what it takes to be worth the merging. Still, the law of loneliness of the human soul and of seeking fulfillment in the complementing of the other sex is a law from whose operation, as Confucius would say, there is no escape. Hence this inborn loneliness, this need for escape from one's own incompleteness, takes other forms. This is what I mean by the totality of man's and woman's sexuality. To read some of the current books on marriage, one might suppose that the physical gratification of love were the whole content of sexuality. And this is the danger of the Western method, of cutting life up into separate segments and looking at one segment only, such as the isolating of mother love, pinning it down to the action of mammary hormones, and even proving it, the inability to size up the totality of any subject in its indivisible and indeterminate essence. The family system, as it developed in China, therefore became the social group in which man grew up and learned his first lessons in life and continued to operate throughout his life. The family provided the sense of security. If a woman became a widow, the family took care of her. If a child became an orphan, the family brought him up. And if a man was unemployed, the family gave him food and shelter. And above all, when a man grew old, he could comfortably look forward to a life of ease and leisure and respect without ever having to trouble about economic support. Hence the overwhelming importance which Confucianism attached to filial piety. I do not know why the notion Shio is translated in this cumbersome fashion. To be Shio simply means to be a good son or a good daughter. Confucianism provides for the motivation of living, not for man to become a good man in the abstract, but rather in concrete terms to be a good son, a good brother, a good uncle, or a good grandfather. But above all, one begins life as a child, and therefore the matter of being a good son in the family is all-important. For it is in one's childhood that a man's habits are formed, and his general attitude toward his fellow men is established. He is either rebellious and inconsiderate of others, and has no regard for good form in social conduct, or he has learned to consider others, and to give respect and affection to those to whom respect and affection are due. The Confucian theory is that a good son at home automatically becomes a good citizen in the state, because the sense of order and discipline and sense of duty and loyalty are already established in his childhood. The extension of these habits and attitudes at home to society in general is repeatedly emphasized in Confucian philosophy. Respect old age in your home and then extend it to cover respect for old age in society. Love your own child and you will learn to love the children of others. Mencius. In simple English, filial piety simply means good breeding. Good breeding in the young, good form in social intercourse, the formation of habits and customs. Emphasis on certain basic human relationships. These are the threads that form the warp and woof of Confucian social philosophy from the beginning to the end. 6. The ruling class. The Confucianists became the aristocracy of intellect in ancient China, and by reason of the imperial system of examinations for selection of talent for civil service, the ruling class of China. The Confucianists became a class by themselves, with the class consciousness of an aristocracy of learning. And there was much to be said for this system of imperial examinations. It was a system open to all, except the children of barbers and butchers, and rewarded its members with imperial government honors and national recognition. It was a distinctive institution of the empire and involved a series of competitions for championship in literary honors, with very rigid controls against favoritism or corruption. First, there was a district examination. Those who qualified had a double-checked examination under a provincial commissioner, on the lookout for those who had got in by accident and for real talents who might have failed. Every form of encouragement and search for possible talent, like scholarships, was given to the young scholars. Those who made grades A and B, say, like college graduates, or more precisely like a French licentiate or a graduate of a German gymnasium, had the right to join the provincial examinations, which were also held once in 3 years. Here the chief examiner was an official directly appointed from the capital to supervise the competition with the assistance of 18 other judges carefully selected. The descent of the imperial examiner from the capital was like that of one holding the power of life and death over the candidates. The successful candidates of the provincial competition, like M.A., then qualified to enter the national examinations at the capital, which was called also Huishi, or the final series, and also Ta Pai, or the great competition, meaning a competition of all the talents of the nation. This was held at the capital in the autumn once every 3 years, and was followed by the palace examinations in the following spring under the supervision of the emperor himself. The successful ones became Qinshi, or PhDs, graded A, B, and C. All Qinshi were established for life. Even the M, A, S, and B, A, S acquired a definite standing in the Confucian hierarchy of scholarship. It was the most important date in a man's life. In Chinese biographies, the dates of birth and death are often missing, but the year one took an M, A, or a PhD is always mentioned. The number one in the palace examinations among the Qinshi became the national champion in letters, the Chuangyuan. It was the hope of every brilliant scholar to capture that great honor, as expressed in the lively phrase, a dead Qinshi but a living Churen, or M.A., for while a Churen. There was still hope of becoming the national champion, but for a Qinshi, the chance had already been lost. The controls were very strict. At all levels, the candidates' bodies were physically searched. They were shut up in cubbyholes for about 3 days in the district exams while passing the tests, bringing their own food but given hot drinks and going to the toilet under supervision. At the national examinations, even the examiners themselves were shut up in the palace. For the palace examinations were held in the front throne hall, and the examiners were forbidden to communicate with the outside world until the grading was over and the results announced. This meant a complete isolation from the world for a minimum of a few weeks. There were 4 bureaus in charge of the papers, one for reception and register of the examination papers, another for the replacing of the names of the candidates with serial numbers and properly sealing them, a third for recopying the papers in red ink to avoid favoritism through recognition of a person's handwriting, and a fourth for checking between the copied papers in red and the originals in black ink. The chief examiner was usually the Minister of Education or the President of the Hanlin Academy, assisted by vice ministers and other prominent officials selected personally by the emperor himself. Finally, the judges agreed on a list of successful candidates who were thus admitted to the Golden Register. The first 10 papers were selected, from among whom the national champion in letters was to come, the names of their authors revealed and submitted to the emperor. The emperor then had an oral interview with the first 10 and made notes of their personal appearance and their intelligence, their character and their ability to answer questions, and made his own grading of the first 3. Finally, the results were announced, and His Majesty personally decorated the national champion in letters, sometimes also presenting him with a princess for a wife. He was crowned, put on a white horse, and paraded through the streets of the capital. All this had to do with the formation of the ruling class, the aristocracy of intellect, and the high respect for learning in ancient China. The imperial examinations began in Tang dynasty in the 8th century, with modifications in the successive dynasties. The ruling class were of course all Confucianists, and they were required to follow the Confucian code of honor more strictly than others, and were also exempt from corporeal punishments at court. On the whole, the social structure was that of an aristocracy of intellect, believing in the supremacy of learning and of reason, and conscious of its powers and responsibilities. It was this fact which, as reported by the Jesuits, so aroused the enthusiasm of the 18th century rationalists of Europe, like Leibniz, Voltaire, and Diderot. Confucian humanism had considerable influence upon the philosophers of the Enlightenment in Europe. These men believed in the advance of the sciences and the ordering of human society on a pattern of reason. Confucianist China seemed to them to stand for such an example. Leibniz's concepts of the monad and of pre-established harmony were similar to the Neo-Confucian ideas, if not directly inspired by them. He admired the Confucian emphasis on practical life and on education for socially useful action. Leibniz, in fact, went into raptures over this Confucian system of thought. In his preface to the Novissima Sinica, he said, "The condition of affairs among ourselves seems to me to be such that, in view of the inordinate length to which the corruption of morals has advanced, I almost think it necessary that Chinese missionaries should be sent to us to teach us the aim and practice of natural theology, as we send missionaries to them to instruct them in revealed theology. For I believe that if a wise man were to be appointed judge, not of the beauty of goddesses, but of the goodness of peoples, he would award the golden apple to the Chinese, unless, indeed, we should outdo them in nobility by conferring on them that which is, indeed, a superhuman good, the divine gift of the Christian religion." Likewise Voltaire, who was anti-clerical and against supernatural theology and believed in reason, wrote extensively about China in his essays Sur les moeurs et l'esprit des nations and in the Philosophical Dictionary. Among other things, he says, "One need not be obsessed with the merits of the Chinese to recognize at least that the organization of their empire is in truth the best that the world has ever seen, and moreover the only one founded on paternal authority." Voltaire, I think, imagined China to be better than she really was. Although it is true that he lived at a time when China was under the glamorous reigns of Kangxi and Qinlong, he asked, "What should our European princes do when they hear of such examples? Admire and blush, but above all imitate." Diderot in his encyclopedia says, "These people, gifted with a consentment unanime, are superior to all other Asiatics in antiquity, in intellect, art, wisdom, policy, and in their taste for philosophy. Nay, in the judgment of certain authors, they dispute the palm in these matters with the most enlightened peoples of Europe." That was true enough in the period of peace and blossoming of the arts under Emperor Qinlong. In the Rococo period, China was held up as the land of reason, and there was a cult for things Chinese. In 1701, the Leibniz Berlin Society of Sciences obtained a grant for planting mulberry trees for the feeding of silkworms. Chinese gardening, as seen in the English garden of the 18th century, became a cult. Socially, men wore queues, as George Washington did, and colored silk brocades, and some courtiers and their ladies were carried about in sedan chairs. See Adolf Reichwein, China and Europe, Kegan Paul, London, 1925. I cannot conjecture what the course of development in European thought would have been if the age of reason had not been followed and largely superseded by the upsurge of a mechanical materialism in the following century. The Chinese heritage and the European heritage, Greek philosophy, scholastic theology, Galileo, Bacon, and Descartes, and so on were different and therefore led to different developments. Western men were born with knives in their brains. The weapon of logic was too sharp. It cut up almost everything which came into contact with it, and offended the truth which was always whole. Supernatural religion lost ground, but the scholastic habits of mind remained. Man began to study himself by dissecting himself. He produced some monsters of puerile, quasi-scientific materialism and pushed himself overboard. But at least in one thing the East and the West behaved alike. Rationalism was followed by Romanticism. In China, this romantic reaction against Confucian rationalism and decorum and propriety came in the form of the Taoism of Laozi and Chuangzi. Romanticism was a necessary psychological reaction against barren reason. One could be terribly tired of reason. A properly rational society in which man always acted according to reason could be very boring to a grown-up, just as a mansion, well scrubbed and well dusted and well ordered by a staff of efficient butlers and matrons, could be to a normal child. Man has feelings and sometimes not unreasonable dreams. Therefore, Romanticism had to follow rationalism. What is true of Chinese rationalism is true of any rationalist philosophy and of any scheme for a future society of the world. Let's organize life and society, but a wise man would see to it that life and society are not too well organized. The Chinese nation could not have survived 2,000 years if every man performed his Confucianist duties and every step that was taken according to the light of reason. Any materialistic philosophy, which is mechanistic in its method, as Confucianism was not, would necessarily go further than Confucian rationalism and proceed to regard both the producer and the product in terms of units of work done. A mechanical mind would produce a mechanical universe and proceed to organize human life on the model of the completely rational society of the ants or bees. It must produce a Marxist society in which production alone is God, and wherein human individuals are necessarily sacrificed before it. In the Red Chinese communes, man is already heading for the society of bees. I see mechanical minds galore in Western society. I shall deal with this in the chapter on materialism. Fortunately for China, the Chinese were half of the time Taoists.